another thing you can do with functions besides, assigning objects, assigning names to them, is to pass them as arguments to function calls. So what does that even mean, and why would you ever want to do that? So remember those for of loops a while back? So remember how one of the recommended ways to iterate through an array is to use for of. So for this, in this example, we have const x, hello world, goodbye. And then we just iterate through it, right? So it's a little wider, so I'm going to put it smaller. And then on every iteration through, the first one it's E is hello, the second one is world, the third one is goodbye, and so forth. So this is fine. You could do this. It's perfectly fine. But there's actually another way that some other people recommend you to iterate. So Google Scholar Guide says use for of loops. That's great. It's fine. But the Airbnb style guide is actually a bit more restrictive. It says don't use loops at all. And it wants you to use functions, special functions such as for each, map, and other functions to iterate over items. And this is sometimes known as what's called a functional programming style, which is to use special functions where you pass functions in as arguments, which are called kind of higher order functions as well. It's a style of programming that some people prefer that basically avoids using loops or for loops or explicit loops. So here is the same code or similar code. Instead of using a for if loop, the bottom shows the code using the for each function and with a special print me function passed in. So let's go here. So remember how there's a for if loop? So we're going to show it now with no loop. It's very similar code. So we're going to have x is hello world goodbye. And now print me is a function that takes in a one argument e and just prints element colon that e. It's the same code as it was in our for of loop before. So now what this says is we're going to call a special for each function or method on the x array. And what are we going to pass into it? We're going to pass in the print me function. So this is weird. We're going to call a function for each, and the argument is going to be the name of another function. So what for each does is that it iterates over each element, just like its name suggests. It for each element here, it's going to call the function I pass in, print me, with the argument set to that element. So if we do that, the first time through the function, print me will be called with e equals hello. So now e equals hello, so we're going to print element hello, and we're going to return undefined. The second time through, for each says, I'm going to call print me again because you passed me in print me, and now I'm going to set e equals world. And if we do that, you'll notice that it will print element world, and then finally goodbye, and we're set. So this acts pretty much the same as the for loop, except it does it in what's called a functional way. It does it by calling a special function and having you pass another function in as an argument. So some would say that this is a cleaner way, but some like the for loop as well. I mean, you could use either way, really. But if you really notice this, does print me really need a name, right? Like we define this print me function only to pass it into for each, and we're probably not going to use print me ever again. So it's kind of troublesome to name the function even if we're only going to use it once. So there's a shorthand we could use, which is to use an anonymous function. We're going to use an arrow function now. So recall that print me is a function that we only define to pass into here. So instead, why don't we do this? Why don't we just declare a function inside of here with the body of this? So if we get rid of print me, what we can do now is the for each now, if you actually look at the for each, it'll actually jump in this function. The first time it jumps in, e is hello. We're going to print element hello. The second time it jumps in, e is world. It jumps in here, e is world. We're going to print world and then goodbye. It does the exact same thing. But how this code reads is that it's a anonymous function with no name. E is the first only parameter. Arrow goes to braces. and the body of the function says just print element e. So this thing is the exact same code as print me, except we don't need a name, and we can define it directly in line inside of the for each. So the advantage of that is that it's just a bit more compact, right? It's just a stylistic preference. You can do the print me if you want to name it and if it's more clear for you, but a lot of people find this thing bolded in orange at the bottom, this anonymous function, really more clear and elegant because you don't need an extra name floating around. But it's the same code, right? If you actually look at the code, they're both defining a function that takes in one eparam argument and prints out element colon e. It's called an anonymous function, like I just mentioned. These are actually really common in JavaScript to be used in what's called callbacks and other sorts of event handlers. You define these using the arrows, so don't ever use the function keyword to define these, because I know I said technically you should use the arrows when you're inside of braces, but like this is kind of like you're nested inside of something else, right? You're defining it inside of another function. So don't use the function keyword to define this, use the arrows, because it just avoids, again, subtleties with, this and other sorts of things. There's another form to the for each. So for each can actually, nicely enough, it actually takes in functions not only of one argument, but of two arguments. So if you actually pass it in a function with two arguments, e and I just named them e and I, then what you can do is you can actually print the number. So actually, when you go through now, e is hello, I is 0. It's the 0th element. The world is the first element. And goodbye is the second element. So the nice thing about the for each is, this has to be made by the creators of for each, but it says you can pass me in a one element function, argument function, or you can pass me in a two argument function. Both ways work just fine. And if you pass me in two arguments, the second one I'll turn into the index or the position. So this might be useful because you might want to use position in something, just a convenience. Map is also another function that takes a function as an argument. What map does is similar to for each by iterating over every element one at a time. But instead of just doing an action, what map does is it actually returns a new array with every element processed by that function. So here's an example of doing it manually. So here's the for loop example. So let's say we have a x is here, is hello world goodbye. And now what I want to do is define a y to be an empty array. So y is an empty array here. And now I'm going to just use a for loop. So I'm going to iterate through x. So the first element here is hello, just a normal for loop iteration. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this to uppercase, which means I'm going to capitalize the letters. And then I'm going to push it onto y. I'm going to just append it onto the end of y. So if I run this, notice how I turn this x, this hello, into uppercase, and then I appended it onto y. So now y has one thing. When I keep on going, the next one, x is world, e is world, sorry, e is world. I'm going to uppercase it, I'm going to push it onto y. So now y will have two things, hello and world. And if I do the third one, I do goodbye, and I'm going to uppercase it and push it on goodbye, and then I'm done. So now y is the same thing as x, except all the elements have been run through this to uppercase and capitalize. So the nice thing about this style of programming is that the x never gets destroyed, right? So the reason why you want to build up a new array instead of modifying the old one is that you might not want to destroy the old one. So it's actually a fairly common pattern to try to build up a new array that's a modified version of the old one. Okay, so this is how you do it with a for loop. So how do we do it with a map? So it turns out that you can use what's called a map function. The visualizer doesn't show it super well, but I'll still demonstrate it. So we can achieve the same functionality of creating a new array that is a variant of the old array by using what's called a map function. So x is hello world goodbye here. I'm just going to shrink it to show it a bit. So now what we say here, let's read this out. So it says const y. So y is something new. And then what is y assigned to? Y is assigned to x.map. We're going to declare an anonymous function e one element. And this anonymous function takes some element and returns the to uppercase version of it to its caller. So what map will do is that it will iterate through all three things, hello, world, and goodbye, and pass it into this anonymous function as a argument, and then we're going to get the uppercase value back. So the first one is we're going to do hello. So the return value of hello is hello to uppercase, which is capital hello. Now the visualizer doesn't show this well, but what map is doing is actually building up a new array behind the scenes. But we can't actually see that till the end, unfortunately. So the next one is world. So what do we return? World to uppercase, which is capital world. And the third one is goodbye, and returns goodbye to uppercase, goodbye. So now at the very end, what map does is it actually builds up a new array with all of the return values, hello, world, and goodbye, all caps, and then it assigns it to constant y here. So again, the visualizer does a good job here, but basically what this line says is that we're going to iterate through all these x's. We're going to use the map to call the inside function once on every element, and then construct a new array with the return values, and then put it to y. So this is the exact same thing as a for loop, except we don't need a loop. Okay, so what are the advantages of using, say, map versus for of? I mean, you can do the exact same thing. Some people prefer what's called a functional style of writing functions and not writing loops. So one way to think about this conceptually is that the for loop, if you want to read it out loud in English or pseudocode, it reads something like this. It says, first create a new empty array y. Now iterate through each element of the x array, assign e to it, then uppercase the e, then push a new element onto the y array. So that's literally what the for loop does. It does an iterative step-by-step process. Now, if you look at the map on the bottom, if you kind of squint hard enough, I think that you'll see that the relationship between y and x is a bit more direct. So what the map says is y should be an uppercase version of x. Because actually, if you look here, you know, if you kind of read kind of in code, you say that const x equals something. So then we just say directly const y equals, it equals this thing. So what does it equal? It equals x.map of a relationship, a function, literally it's a function, right? That takes in one thing and arrows and turns it into an uppercase version. So by reading this directly, it kind of reads like y should be an uppercase version of x. Y is an x mapped to an uppercase transformation. That's what people oftentimes mean when they say functional programming, that you can express things as combinations of functions instead of as kind of an iterative loop that right here y is an empty array, and then we're iterating, we're pushing, and then we're uppercasing and such. So it's a subtle distinction, but some people like the second form. It's also a little less code. Another thing you can do to shortcut it even more is that if you only have one argument to your inner function and one return value, you can actually make the syntax way simpler. So if you have one argument and one return statement, you can eliminate the parentheses and you can eliminate the braces. So instead of doing, because we only have one argument, we can eliminate the parentheses. Sorry, eliminate the parentheses here. And we can also eliminate these braces and the return statement. So if I do all this, assuming it works, if I do all this, notice how our code is actually really small now, right? Now this actually kind of looks like y should be an uppercase version of x. I'm just going to show it here. So this still looks like there's a bunch of parentheses and braces and return values, and it's like, yeah, it might work if you squint at it. But if you only have one argument, one return statement, you can get rid of the parentheses, get rid of the braces, get rid of the return statement, and this actually looks like a mapping, right? It actually looks like you take an E and you do an arrow to E dot to uppercase. So the real kind of final bit really does say y should be an uppercase version of x, right? If you read this out loud down here, or my code down here, it really says, you know, what is const y? Oh yeah, const y is x map E to uppercase. It's an uppercase version of x, and that's exactly what it is. X is here, y is an uppercase version of x. And notice how we've done this all in 2 lines of code, right? One line defines x. The second line magically, well, it runs a lot of times, but the second line magically defines y as uppercase x. And notice how this is a lot less code now than the for loop, right? I mean, this one-liner is a lot less code than the for loop, and hopefully less error prone as well. So this is a flavor of why people like these passing functions into other functions in a functional programming style, because they can express some of their data processing thoughts more concisely. So to iterate through items and objects, remember there's a for of loop. So instead you could just do a for each, right? So you can do a for each instead of a for of loop. This functions just like the analogy for array. So you can study this code in detail to see how the for each works here, but I just want to get it just to make sure it works. And here's an object, and again, it's the for each. You're going to go through every key. So you basically grab the keys out and you for each it. And without a for loop, we take every E, and then we're going to console log E. We're going to look up ages E. So the first E is going to be Joe, and then we're going to print him out because Joe is 25, because we're going to look him up. This is exactly like deja vu before with the for loop, but there's no loop. Pamela is 30 and Bobby is 100. So again, this objects.keys creates an array, and then we're going to for each over that array. And for each thing, if you're reading again in functional in English, it says, grab me the keys of ages. Once you've grabbed them, do a for each, and for each of the keys, run this function. For each of the keys, run this function. And what this function is give me the key, give me an arrow, give me the value, which looks it up in ages, and then print it out to the console. Okay, recap of functions. So use the function keyword to declare top-level functions. Use the arrow syntax, the equal sign greater than, to declare functions inside of braces, and anonymous functions, right? Those are the functions that you pass to other functions without declaring a name. So use the arrow syntax always. Functions can be assigned to variables, and they can also be passed as arguments to other function calls like for each and map. And to iterate over arrays and objects, consider using functions such as for each and map instead of loops. Again, this is a stylistic choice. You can do it if you want, but I just want to present different alternatives.